Welcome to the Barakat Trust podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Barakat Trust. My name is Thomas Adkins, and today I am delighted to be joined by Jerry Brotton. Welcome, Jerry, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Thomas.
And today we're going to be talking slightly away from the normal regions that this podcast covers, and we're turning to England, where we're going to be looking at the arts and England's early relations with the Islamic world. And this is part of the Barakat Trust's podcast series this year titled Peripheries, where we're examining the relation between the regions normally considered the central lands of the Islamic world and peripheral regions that aren't normally considered when we think about the term Islamic art or the Islamic world. And so hence why we're in England. And Jerry seems the perfect person to talk on this topic with us. And I should briefly introduce him. Officially, Jerry is Professor of Renaissance Studies at Queen Mary University of London, where he also received his PhD. But his activities stretch far beyond academia, also into radio programming, exhibition curation, and popular history. Jerry is the author of several historical non-fiction books, including on maps in the early modern era, The 4 Points of the Compass, and Shakespeare. But it is specifically a book Jerry published in 2016 that first caught my attention when thinking about this series of peripheries. And the book was called This Orient Isle, Elizabethan England and the Islamic World. And so here we are 10 years later after its publication, and we're here to sort of revisit some of the themes in that book and look specifically in this podcast at some of the artistic production, whether in portraiture, fashion, or drama, that resulted from this early relationship between Elizabethan England and the Islamic world. And so maybe, Jerry, I could ask you to kick us off with a brief sketch of Elizabethan England and maybe some of the common misconceptions that surround England's early encounter with the Islamic world.
Right, absolutely. Thanks, Thomas. I mean, it's great to be talking to you about this and the kind of audience that I think will be engaging with it, because we tend to think of Elizabethan England first as a historical period, which is 1558 to 1603 in the Christian calendar. That's the period that Elizabeth I rules. She is really the end of what's called the Tudor line, the Tudor dynasty, and she dies in 1603 childless, and so the Stuarts take over. That's a whole other area of English history. But what's really interesting is that in the popular conception and in the English nationalist imagination, this is a period which is seemingly almost exclusively white. It's quite male, although immediately you go, hang on, but she was a queen, so how does that go? So it starts to unravel quite quickly, but there is a sense in which this is a period about, white men. It's about Shakespeare, it's about Sir Walter Raleigh, it's about these kind of grand men and the grand stories about Englishness and the beginnings of the English Empire. I think that that's all a bit of a myth. I think that that's been really from the 19th century. English nationalism and education has told itself that because they want to tell a story about the British English Empire that stretches right back to the Elizabethan period. And I think more than ever, it's become a touchstone for some really rather toxic forms of English white nationalism. So it underpins, I think, some of the right-wing positions at the moment in the media, which I'm not very comfortable with. And I think that what they're doing is appropriating a myth about the Elizabethan period. What I see in the research I've done is that this is a period where Elizabethan England is very isolated within Europe and the wider world, because it's become a Protestant state. It's broken from the rest of Catholic Europe. It is very isolated. It's seen as a rogue state. Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558. By 1570, she's excommunicated, which is a posh way of saying she's kicked out of the Catholic Church. Protestant England is on its own, and it's really under threat. And the only thing it can think about to reach out is to other equally powerful powers and empires, which are those in the Muslim world. It's particularly the Ottoman Empire, which at that point is as large, if not larger, than the Spanish Habsburg Empire. It's to also work with North African Muslim states, particularly in the Maghreb, so especially the Moroccan area, the Saadi dynasty at the time. The Elizabethans do this, and they do that, and they reach out really as inferiors. Again, we've misunderstood this whole period, that we think somehow, and we've been taught, or when I say we, that's a big wide question. We, in terms of how English national education has
Mm.
taught us a certain version of Englishness, says that this was a very powerful empire at the center of Europe. It is not. They're reaching out as what I call a vassal state. Elizabeth, from the late 1570s, is writing to the Ottoman Sultan Murad III and saying, please, can I be your ally? She's trying to
Mhm.
establish economic, commercial, and political alliances. Fascinating. This has tended to be cut out of the period. What I see is that it's absolutely central to how Elizabethan England prospers. It's making alliances with the Islamic world on an equal, if not an inferior footing, saying, we want an alliance with you. The Ottomans write back early on and say, who are you? We don't know who you are. You're a very small, minor little state on the edge of Europe. They're used to dealing with the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Chinese. They've no interest in this small little island in the corner of Northern Europe. So that's really the context where the research comes out of, to tell a very different kind of story when you look more carefully, when you acknowledge the Elizabethan connections right from Morocco right through to India,
Mm.
throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, what we call the Levant, throughout even Persia, encounters with Shia communities as well as Sunni communities in Egypt, across the Mediterranean, in North Africa. All these areas are ones that they're trying to make alliances with. And that's really the context of how we should add that to the mix of when we're thinking about what Elizabethan England is all about.
Definitely. And I believe this is also the time that the joint stock companies of the Royal Levant Company and the East India Company are also in ascendancy. Is that correct?
Yeah, we think about the East India Company, and we think how that is the formation of the British Raj later in the really from the only the late 18th and really the 19th century. The
Mm.
British Empire is a very short-lived little period. We think of it as so expansive, but actually it's not. But the East India Company is formed in 1600. My argument in the book, and based on the research, is that the East India Company is bedrocked on a whole generation of English joint stock companies, initiatives which are designed to work with Islamic communities. So these go back right to the 1560s when they set up what's called the Muscovy Company, which is a bit confusing because Muscovy is often an archaic word for Russia, but it's
Mm.
actually an attempt in the 1550s by English merchants to get to Persia. There is
Okay.
then the establishment of the Turkey Company, which, as it suggests, is working with the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which is from the late 1570s. In the 1580s, you get the development of what's called the Barbary Company, which is working in modern day Morocco. Barbary Company a bit different. It's not a joint stock company, but to simplify what a joint stock company is, it's basically when a bunch of merchants come together and they put a pot of money in. You, me, and a bunch of our friends say, right, we'll all
Yeah.
put in £1,000 to fund a commercial initiative, say going to
Hmm.
Marrakesh. We will then share out the profits. If there's a loss and the boat that we send out is shipwrecked or it all goes wrong, we also stand the cost. That very simply is what a joint stock company is. So all these joint stock companies are being set up because we don't realize that Elizabeth is very poor and also she's politically very vulnerable. So she is not
Mm.
behind it. She's quietly supporting it because she wants to enrich the Elizabethan state. But that's really what these joint stock companies are. And so again, we forget the Levant Company comes out of the Turkey Company. And the East India Company comes out of all these different joint stock companies. Many of the people who sign up for it in 1600 are already signatories and members of the other kind of joint stock companies. So if you don't have these encounters with the Islamic world from the 1550s and the other joint stock companies, you don't get the
Mm.
East India Company and you
Yeah.
don't get the Levant Company.
And so this is important background and of how the British Empire would later come to be involved in many parts of the world, including the Islamic world. So if we are just to bring us back towards Elizabeth and a more specific example, really, you've mentioned Morocco, the Ottoman Empire, Persia as well. In your book, you talk extensively at the beginning about a certain Abdel Wahid bin Mas'ud al-Annuri,
Mm.
who was the Moroccan ambassador sent to England. I wondered if you could just briefly illustrate or tell us about his story and what this is emblematic of at this point. We've mentioned a bit about, you've spoken about Elizabeth being in a position of inferiority. What was this ambassadorship all about? And later we'll move on to the arts and the portrait that came out about it. But
it's such an amazing story. So this character we call al-Annuri, as you described, we believe he's a Moroccan ambassador who is sent by the Saadian dynasty to come to London in 1600 as a high-level diplomatic figure who is representing Saadian interests in relation to the Barbary Company. Now, this is 1600. Elizabeth dies 3 years later. She welcomes him in great pomp and ceremony. He stays on the Strand. He has a whole entourage that come with him. We believe the descriptions are that he and his entourage slaughter their meat halal. Their religious observations and practices are also described. Some of the entourage are said to die while they're in London for around 6 months. So we therefore have Muslims buried somewhere around the Strand, which is fascinating and extraordinary. And al-Annuri meets Elizabeth on these high-level ambassadorial meetings at least twice. They speak in a mixture of Latin, Spanish, and Italian. He's clearly a very, very cosmopolitan figure. And what he's doing is negotiating with the Elizabethan state and the Barbary Company, not only a commercial alliance with Morocco, but also a military and political alliance to try and reconquer Al-Andalus, Spain, in this period, using Elizabethan ships and Moroccan money based on their conquest of the Saharan region at that time and the gold that's coming in to the Saudi coffers. So this is an amazing alliance, which clearly is negotiated in great depth. The al-Annuri stays in London for 6 months, and it only, I think, doesn't come off because the Elizabethans have a much more long-standing alliance with the Ottomans.
okay.
And at this time, as some of your audience will know, there's a conflict between the Saadian dynasty and the Ottomans precisely in this period. So Elizabeth makes the choice to not go through with that alliance fully, although it's bedrocked on the back of nearly 50 years of Anglo-Moroccan trade that's been going on throughout this period, very, very extensive. But the al-Annuri embassy is noted by many people. And yes, there is some sort of concern about, they talk about, the barbarian al-Annuri, but others say, this guy's a high-level figure. We respect him. We admire him. This is an alliance which is in the national interest. So different positions, not the kind of ones that you might necessarily expect in terms of Anglo-Muslim relations back in 1600. Amazing, in 1600.
And I mean, you raise an interesting point as well about suggesting why it didn't come through the negotiation, because of Elizabethan England's simultaneous negotiations with the Ottoman Empire, which I think raises an important point that, okay, the title of this episode is England's early relations with the Islamic world, but actually this isn't a bloc. This is a diverse, multipolar region of which Morocco is just one polity. You mentioned that there are people at the time noting the arrival of al-Annuri in London and making comments. And so clearly there's a huge amount of historical writing or documentation that allows you to do the research, some of which maybe chronicles, other types of official documentation, letters. But what I'd like to focus on now is specifically some of the arts that came out of this relationship. There is, well, I'll let you talk about it, but a specific portrait that I would like to focus on.
This is an amazing portrait. It's currently in Birmingham at the Shakespeare Institute of all places. And what it shows is what we believe is al-Annuri. I think it was probably commissioned and painted for the alliance that everybody expected was about to happen. So it's painted to celebrate it. And then at the last minute, it doesn't happen. The portrait sort of disappears and then reappears in the mid-20th century and shows this remarkable figure, absolutely remarkable, a turbaned figure with a full beard. You see the scimitar at his left-hand side. You see the dress in absolute precise detail, and the piercing look this figure gives you, I think, is what's really very striking about it. You also have some details here some text which is also fascinating. So in the top
Mm,
left-hand corner, it gives you a date in the Christian calendar of 1600. It gives a
mm,
version of his name. It gives his age as 42, which I think is very interesting because if this was painted in 1600, which we imagine, which was his time in London, that
mhm,
means he was born in 1558 in the Christian calendar, the same year that Elizabeth came to power. There's some
mm,
Latin on the right-hand side, which describes him as basically the royal ambassador from Arabia in England, in Anglium. So this is clearly marked as some high-level diplomatic image. And what I find fascinating is, for the first thing, that he allows himself to be painted,
mhm,
because, as your audience will know, obviously in the Islamic tradition, the aniconic tradition about not representing the figure is an interesting one. Some of the scholars wonder if he may actually be what's known as a Morisco, that he may have been a Spanish-born Muslim who, because of his cosmopolitanism, would therefore speak various languages. He works through different cultures. He leaves Spain at the time because of the terrible theological climate, and he goes to Morocco. He ends up being an ambassador. That's just one theory, which I think is
mhm.
really quite fascinating because
Definitely.
no high-level members of the Saadian dynasty have their portraits painted. We don't have
Mhm,
any of those images, but we have this of al-Annuri. And it is that look. This is the look of a figure. He looks at you. This is not somebody who is an inferior. This is somebody who's a high level figure who says, I'm
mhm,
important, I am significant. And I think it's just a really, really iconic image of Anglo-Islamic relations that we've lost sight of.
mhm,
Art historians are now taking this portrait much more seriously than they used to. One art historian, very well respected art historian, when I was working on this image decades ago, said to me, I don't believe this image can be real. I think it must have been, a fake or done in the
mhm,
19th century. And I remember saying to them, no, that's because it's not. It's because you cannot acknowledge the extent of Anglo-Islamic relations because your Western European educational training contains no account of it. It's just been completely missed out. And now that same person who will remain anonymous acknowledges that the portrait
mhm.
is legitimate. And
Yeah.
another art historian that I know has actually attributed it to a very significant English painter. And this is a very recent, very new attribution called
Okay.
Robert Peake. If that's the case, that again, I think underlines the importance of this image, that Peake is one of the main court painters to Elizabeth. This is a
Mhm,
really, really significant painting. And I think for me, is so powerful. It almost sums up a whole generation of Anglo-Islamic relations that have been going
mm,
on, not just with Morocco, but also with the Ottomans, with Persia, and beyond that. But the fact this portrait exists, I think, tells us something about the scale and the depth and the quite amicable exchange here around
mhm.
diplomacy and trade that we have completely missed out on. And we've
Yeah,
completely missed out on. And I think it's is obviously a contentious area, but it is really because of a refusal in a mainstream English white Christian academic tradition of acknowledging the place of Islam.
definitely. And people interpret another portrait, not of al-Annuri, but of Elizabeth herself, a very famous portrait called the Rainbow Portrait.
Mm.
Some people interpret this as including or depicting Elizabeth wearing jewelry and embroidery of a certain Eastern or Islamic style, whichever word you wish to use. I wonder if you could just add something on this portrait and also give a little description. I've got both of them up in
Yeah.
front of me next to each other. Both sort of have this slightly sideways orientation, with both with very piercing eyes in their own way.
It's really fascinating. So, she has these iconic portraits, and this is one of the most famous one, the Rainbow
Mm,
Portrait, as it's called, which is unbelievably vivid in its coloring. She's wearing a sort of lavish, we'd say, sort of orangey red
mm,
outfit. A corset which is beautifully embroidered with flowers. She wears a most elaborate headset and is just bedecked with jewels. Now we look at this and we see it's quintessentially Elizabethan somehow.
Mm.
But actually, you look at all the materials, you look at the silks, you look at the furs, you look at the jewelry. It is all what we would broadly call Eastern. It was all pretty much come through from the Silk Road through Islamic cultures and communities. And we forget it because we see it as somehow very classically English. It's not at all. And she's almost wearing a whole generation of trade and exchange with Islamic communities, particularly through the Ottoman territories, but also through North Africa. And so, the pearls come from the Red Sea, and again, they will have come through Ottoman territories. Everything really that we see is what we might call syncretic. Syncretic being, the mixing and the crossing over of different cultures. And she's almost showing off the fact that that's part of what the Elizabethans about. We have this extraordinary trade and exchange with the Islamic world. But again, we've tended to flatten that out and read it as somehow quintessentially English, Tudor. And we need to rethink that, just as we need to include the al-Annuri portrait as really as important and as iconic as this kind of image here. And there are many of these portraits, not just the rainbow portrait. And when people start to look at them, and I think many of the people hopefully listening to this podcast might look at those portraits again and say, oh, yes, of course, that's a design it's quite Ottoman, or there's something quite Egyptian about that design, or, oh, that kind of fabric. Yes, because none of it is English. None of it is European. So we think we have to rethink what we're looking at there.
Yeah, I mean, this is all materials, as you've just said, that couldn't be produced in England at the time.
Yeah, and I think a lot of them probably come through places like Italy. But they themselves have then come through Islamic territories as well, because we can talk about the Elizabethan period, but then we can go back even further and talk about how all the Italian Renaissance city-states from the late 15th century are also drawing on Islamic and Arabic traditions. So even late 14th century paintings by Giotto, are showing Islamic inscriptions. They're trying to work out what exactly it is that they're seeing. But again, it's there. We miss it. It's hidden in plain view.
And your mention of the city-states of Italy in this period is, well, I suppose a perfect segue into my next point about the arts, which takes us away from portraiture and into theatre, where also at this time, we don't just see Muslim figures appearing in ambassadorial positions or materials that have come from the Islamic world appearing on portraits. We also have Muslim figures appearing in drama. And maybe the most famous example of that is Othello, the Moor of Venice. And so what is happening in a different corner of the arts world, in theatre in London at this time? Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, who are these characters that they begin to depict that weren't appearing before in English drama?
Again, we've missed out on this. The fact that people tend to think, if you talk about Shakespeare and Islam and Moors, this phrase, the Moor, Othello is the Moor. So Moor comes from a certain tradition which we understand as being Mauritania. So there's the Roman Latin tradition of the Moor, but it's then also North Africa as a Muslim figure. So Moor is a synonym for a Muslim figure. So we all say, oh, yes, well, there's Othello. But actually, what my research showed is that we date Othello to around 1601, 1602. I think that it's partly a response to al-Annuri being in London. I'm not saying he's the model for Othello, but the fact that this guy is so present, he's having his portrait painted, he's living on the Strand, there's a lot of chatter, as we'd say, around him. I think that Shakespeare and other dramatists of the time, their job is to sort of pick up on those currents. And I'm not saying Othello is al-Annuri, but I think that he's part of the story. I think he's part of why Shakespeare is so interested in staging a figure that he calls a Moor just straight after al-Annuri's time in London. Very interesting. But this goes back all the way to even the mid-late 1580s. Elizabethan, what we call Elizabethan theatre, let's more call it Tudor theatre, is a commercial practice which only emerges in London, particularly in the East End of London, in the late 1570s. It's a commercial process. Theatre's been around for hundreds, even thousands of years. But this is the first time that you've had purpose-built theatres with people paying
Mm.
money to go and see it and professional actors performing it. This is radically new. And so this is really from the late 1580s that it really takes off. And Shakespeare's great rival and friend, Christopher Marlowe, really starts it with a play called Tamburlaine the Great, which we usually date around 1587, 1588. It is full of Muslim characters. It's full of Persians, Scythians, Moors, every kind of figure. The Ottoman emperor is involved in the scene. Marlowe's plays so successfully, does another version of Tamburlaine the following year. He starts a craze. It is a craze, a fashion to depict various forms of what we would call Muslim figures, all these different names that the playwrights use because they're reading all the contemporary texts about different kinds of figures that we now would call Muslim. They're trying to work it out. They're talking to traders who've been out in the Mediterranean, who've been mixing with Moroccans. They're Moroccan ambassadors who are probably in the audience, who've been coming over since the 1580s. We forget
Yeah.
this. There are regular encounters here. So we know that ambassadors tend to like to come to London and go to the theatre. So why wouldn't these other ambassadors before al-Annuri also be doing it as well? So it seems to me it's again hidden in plain view.
Mm.
And what if you're a playwright, are you drawn to? You're drawn to ambiguous, conflicted, exciting, dangerous figures. And that's the way of thinking about the relationship, I think, between England and Islam in this period. Not as somehow these are people who are, despotic, barbaric. There is some of that language, but I think that the dramatists are much more excited by this idea of, well, we're in an alliance with these Islamic powers, and these people are very sophisticated and they're very elegant and they bring great wealth and they bring great learning. So we want to put them in our plays. Yes, we may find them dangerous, but we also find them alluring and engaging.
Mm.
So all the playwrights, it's an absolute fashion in the 1590s. Every single playwright, names of them I could give you, but they've just disappeared. They're not very interesting. But Marlowe starts the fashion for doing this, and everybody is doing Turk plays, Moor plays, Persian plays. Shakespeare gets in on the act. He has figures with Moors from the very early 1590s. He has Titus Andronicus. One of his most famous plays is Merchant of Venice, which we think of as being a play about Jews and Shylock the moneylender. That's true. But one of the figures in the play is also the Prince of Morocco. Why is the Prince of Morocco casually coming on stage in Merchant of Venice? Because the audience are completely at ease with Anglo-Moroccan relations. They're probably in the
Mm.
audience with people who have traveled to Morocco, have traded there, who've done business there, and they may even be sitting with people, or standing probably, next to people who may have been Moroccans as well. We have records of Moroccans who are living and working in Elizabethan England at this time. So throughout the 1580s and 1590s, the theatre is full of these kind of characters.
Mm.
Shakespeare's history plays are full of references to Turks. There's no Turks actually on the stage. So by the time you get to Othello in around 1601, 1602, there's been a whole tradition.
Yeah.
I was brought up as an undergraduate student being told, yes, there is this play Othello and it's quite exceptional because it puts a, quote, black man on the stage. Well, we hear in the play that he says he's a convert from Islam. He's from Mauritania, and he says, I was a convert, clearly to Christianity. And the play is playing around with that idea of the excitement and also the fear of conversion. There is only one example I found in all of this research of Muslims converting to Christianity. There's one
Mm.
in the 1580s in London. But we know there are hundreds of examples of English men, and we now even think some English women, who are converting to Islam from the
Mm.
1560s and 1570s. One of the great scholars of this work is Nabil Matar. So it's not me who's been doing this work, but there are many of us who've
Mhm.
been doing this archival work. And Nabil Matar has been finding the most fascinating work. Yes, sometimes it's people who are enforced converts, but some not. Some are openly converting to Islam because in the 1580s, if you were particularly an Englishman, a Protestant who's expecting at any moment the Spanish Catholics to invade your country, as does happen with the Spanish Armada in 1588. It fails, but everybody expects that it will happen, and English Protestantism will be wiped out.
Mhm.
So if you're working in the Mediterranean in the 1580s, I'm not surprised that many of these figures convert openly and willingly to Islam.
Mhm.
And I think this is so fascinating that we're still at the early points of finding out the life histories of these figures. It's hard because they don't tend not to leave diaries, they tend not to leave first-hand records.
Yeah.
We're finding these little fragments of
Mhm.
stories of people across particularly the Mediterranean and North Africa who are English, who are born into the Church of England, but are converting and living out their lives as Muslims.
Wow. So I mean, this is really not what one expects to hear
No.
or
No.
even notices, I suppose, when whether reading drama from this period or seeing it performed. I also wonder, is it known at all what characters who were described as Moor or Turk in this period when plays were being performed at the theatre? Is it known what they were wearing?
No,
Any
well,
descriptions?
it's a really good question because we have, again, some of the theatre records. We have this guy Henslow who records all the payments and also descriptions
Mhm.
of clothing and scenery. And he describes things like, yeah, a turban. So he
Okay.
describes various, costumes, which are clearly attempts to understand what they think Muslim dress will be.
Yeah.
We have a drawing of the play Titus Andronicus, which still survives. So one of the early plays, which has the first time that Shakespeare depicts a Moor. He's called Aaron the Moor, and he's shown in this drawing. And it's quite interesting because he's sort of wearing what seems to be a sort of weird Greco-Roman version of clothing, but then everybody else, some people are wearing Tudor costume and some are wearing medieval. So it's a whole mashup, we seem to
Mhm.
think, in terms of costumes.
Yeah.
But there are accounts of they talk about turbans, they talk about robes, they talk about scimitars. So there is some attempt, I think, to try and match what people are seeing, probably on the street, really
Mhm.
important. They're probably seeing people like al-Annuri and these big diplomatic entourages who are traveling around, dressed in what we would consider sort of, standard Muslim garb. And alongside that, they're looking at probably engravings and some drawings, again, which are showing what they think are approximations to particularly North African and Ottoman dress. So there,
Mhm.
there is some attempt at what we might call verisimilitude. They're trying to
Yeah.
depict a certain version of what Muslim dress is like.
And then another attempt, possibly a very contentious one, of how people in this period in England imagined Muslims to what they were wearing and how they behaved, is a final piece of artwork I would like to touch upon briefly called Faith and Mahomet, or the name of the Prophet Muhammad. And this is I say contentious because this is a depiction, it is thought, of the Prophet Muhammad bowing down to Elizabeth. And so I want to ask you where you think this fits in as a piece of artwork from this period, not just in terms of clothing and the depiction of the prophet, but also this idea of conversion that you've just touched upon, that there may have been a few trickles of conversion at this point.
I mean, this is the most extraordinary artwork. It's an embroidery, which is held in, of all places, Hardwick Hall, which is in Derbyshire, in the north of England. And I stumbled across it many, many years ago. And it's an embroidery, quite a large embroidery, which shows a figure next to the word Fides, which we think is probably Elizabeth. So Fides is faith in Latin. So a figure which we think is Elizabeth. Next to her, reclining on the floor, is a figure that we also believe depicts the Prophet Muhammad. And he's holding a book which clearly is labeled Al-Quran. It's a
Mm.
Quran. This is the first depiction that we believe we have of a Quran. And in the background of this embroidery, there is also a depiction of what seems to be a mosque. So this is above the figure of the
Yeah.
Prophet Muhammad. So this is an incredible piece because this is from the 1580s in the north of England. the woman who lives at Hardwick Hall, Alethea Talbot, she's called Bess of Hardwick. The house can still be visited. It's a National Trust house. The embroidery itself is not on display because it's in such ruinous condition, which is a real shame because for me, again, it's such an iconic image of Anglo-Islamic relations in this period. We believe it was embroidered by her women, by her serving women. So again, it has a really interesting element there that it's made by women depicting Elizabeth, depicting the Prophet Muhammad, showing the Al-Quran. I mean, this shows you, even just as I describe it like that, it gives you a sense of the level of detail and the level of knowledge that's clearly in circulation in England in the 1580s to just enable that kind of piece of embroidery to take place. We date it in the 1580s, so I think this is fascinating because it's a period where we know English men are in the Mediterranean and are converting to Islam. And we've also got the drama of the period starting to depict these kind of Islamic figures. So what is it doing? I mean, the kind of more sinister reading might be to say that it's showing Elizabeth as a figure of faith, and she's set against the figure of faithlessness, the ultimate iconic figure of Islam. But I think there's a more ambiguous way of thinking about it because there is nothing particularly negative or awful about that depiction of the Prophet Muhammad or the depiction of a mosque. So I think there's still, again, this level of curiosity and awareness that this is a period by which time most elite men and women like Alethea Talbot know that there are accords between the Elizabethan state and, for instance, the Ottoman Empire. So by 1579, 1580, there are English ambassadors in Constantinople, what we now call as Istanbul. They're establishing trade, commercial, political, and military relations because they're shipping arms to Istanbul, to the Ottoman state, to help the Ottomans fighting not only Persian Shia armies, but also Catholic Spanish ones. So this is a kind of extraordinary kind of exchange that's going on. So the Elizabethans pushing back themselves against Spanish Catholicism and allying themselves with the other great power, which is fighting Spanish Catholicism, which is the Sunni Ottoman Empire. And then you have women in Derbyshire embroidering these kind of images. So, I mean, it's such a, quite literally a complex tapestry or embroidery. These layers that we're seeing of these kind of exchanges and encounters, which are so much far more complicated and so much more ambiguous than any notion of, Tudor England having nothing to do with Islam or demonizing Islam. It's so much more complicated than that. There are so many more interesting, minute elements and dimensions to it that I think for today are really important for our understanding of history and education, and particularly for British Muslim students thinking we have some skin in this game, as a phrase we might use. There is a heritage there which is connected to those British Muslim students. They are part of the story, and they should feel that they are, because they are not out of that story. They are very much in it, and very much in it because it's a complex, messy, difficult history. But that's the nature of history.
For sure. So you mentioned students just now. I want to take a step back. This tapestry you've just described metaphorically, and obviously your book that we've kind of based our discussion on so far today, This Orient Isle, was, I mentioned at the beginning, published in 2016. So I imagine this was something you were writing in the first few years of the 2010s, based on your earlier observations in the 2000s. And you've also mentioned throughout this episode, really, the importance of education, or rather the way that the education system, specifically the history curriculum in England and the UK, is wired today. I wonder if you could just reflect on where you see this book that you've talked about, I know, in various places over the last 10 years, where you see it and where you see this topic and where you see it going 10 years after you first wrote or published about it.
It's a really interesting question, and thanks for letting me think about it, because I guess I was thinking very much about it coming from, as I do, my own background is I come from Bradford in the north of England. Some of your listeners may know very multicultural area, very Muslim, seen as a sort of site of British Muslim communities, rather like Birmingham and London. So for me, it was part of my understanding of what Englishness was about. And I think writing it, as you say, around that period, the 20 teens, prior to Brexit, prior to so much that's happened really in the last 10 years, which I think many of us feel is the wrong direction globally that the world is going in. And I'd always seen, I guess, levels of racism and particularly Islamophobia from being a young kid and going all the way through to my current situation. Again, I live and teach in the East End of London, again, with a significant British Muslim population. Many of my students are British Muslim. So for me, it's very important to tell these kind of stories. So to enable students to say, yes, we are part of this story. We can, because I often feel that those students feel that they can't engage. It's not part of their story, that that's very much a story about mass migration post the Second World War. I don't think that's the case. Yes, mass migration, but we do have a much longer history of Anglo-Islamic relations, which I want to say, yes, let's look at these and let's say that this is part of our very rich, complex national story, and that those British Muslim students can and should be part of that story. But I think, in many ways, since 2016, I suppose I look at it and think what's happened with things like Brexit, and I think, and I do think an intensification of Islamophobia in the British media, more broadly, a move to the right, which I think has caused, huge damage, huge anxiety and stress in communities, which I regret enormously and find very annoying that there's a way in which there's a weaponization of some early elements of what's called English history, which is seen as somehow white, Christian, and exceptional. It's not. So I think more than ever, I think it's important to tell these stories. And I guess it's interesting with the book because the book had some attention, but I think a lot of people were really reluctant to talk about Anglo-Islamic relations in the period of Elizabeth I and Shakespeare, because they're such touchstones of white English national culture. And I think we should. And, some of my most poignant and powerful moments from talking about the book were going into spaces and places where I was mainly talking to British Muslim audiences. Once going into a mosque, and I was really moved that an older woman said to me afterwards in the question and answer session, she said, why does it need you, a white, British man, to come and tell a Muslim British audience about our place in this national history? And I was very moved by it. And I said, well, absolutely. There's certain political reasons why, and we can sit here and talk about that for a long time. But I said, I feel very honored that I can actually kind of have that conversation with you and say, yes, let's talk about that, because it's here. It's in the archive. We're not making it up. This is not some sort of woke fantasy. There's a lot of material which tells us about this. And my hope, I suppose, 10 years later, is that a new generation of British Muslim scholars will start to pick up that and go forward themselves with that work, because you and I, Thomas, know that there's a certain version of what we'd call Orientalism, where, white English European scholars cannot and should not speak for Islamic communities. There is a long, very dishonorable tradition where that has happened. So for me, it's important, I think, to say, no, let's think about how you widen a community of scholars who might be able to do that work, who will see things that I won't see. So very much my hope is, British Muslim students will now come through the system and will start to look at the plays, the archives, the pictures, the paintings, the embroideries, the tapestries, and they will see things that I will not see. And I think that's what's exciting. That's why we do the work we do. That's why scholarship is important, because it does have a trickle-down effect. It does affect when I go into schools, as I do. Just as a funny story, I'll often have local state schools who'll bring their British Muslim students in, and I'll say, hey, we're going to talk about Shakespeare and Islam. And they look so bored and so fed up. By the end of it, they are electrified because they've found out things that they never knew, and they probably go and tell their mum and dad. And that's exciting and it's interesting, and it shows that history is very alive, and it's a site of dispute and debate. But we should also, a word which is often bandied around too much, but empower local communities to be able to, we are part of this story.
Yeah. And I mean, it certainly sounds like there's plenty more for people to still discover, to research, to write about, to talk about. And that's an exciting prospect.
I think so. I think that's right. And so we're not at the end of this. We're really at the beginning of it. And one of the other things I always say when I give these talks is that, and your audience will know I'm sure very poignantly when I say what I'd like to see in the future is teams of scholars working together in places like Morocco, in places like Turkey, in places like Iraq. But the reality, of course, geopolitically is that is very, very challenging. And we all know why that is. But it seems to me that only when we start doing that are we going to really start to find some very exciting things about how different cultures, and not just this sense of the West and the East, but you said it early on, that different versions of what we talk about when we talk about Islam. I wasn't very happy that the book had this phrase, the Islamic world. It created this just idea that there was just one big monolithic thing called the Islamic world. I know, and many of the people listening will know, of course, that is itself a problem to make those assumptions. So there's more to do, different kinds of ways in which we think about those kind of encounters and exchanges. So I think we're only at the beginning of it. So despite the way that the politics are very difficult in many respects, I'm also very excited and hopeful about how the future research and history might develop around these ideas.
Well, thank you for that note of hope and for sharing your thoughts today. It's been wonderful to hear about them. And thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Not at all. It's an absolute pleasure to speak to you, and also to be able to speak to, I'm sure, the people who are going to be listening. So thank you for having me, Thomas.
Thank you for listening to the Barakat Trust podcast.